The arena was vast, built to hold thousands, yet on that day it felt strangely hollow. The air was heavy, carrying a silence that pressed down on everyone present. No music played, no cheers echoed, only the weight of expectation filled the space. It was the kind of silence that made hearts race, where even the smallest sound seemed loud. Those who had gathered waited with curiosity, their eyes fixed on the ground below. They expected a clash, a display of force, the kind of struggle that turned the weak into stories quickly forgotten. Some leaned forward in their seats, whispering to one another, already convinced they knew how the day would end. At the center of the arena stood a lone human. There was no armor shining in the light, no sword raised to impress the crowd, just a figure standing calmly, as if the silence was not a burden but a companion. To many, that stillness looked like weakness. They wondered why anyone so unremarkable had been chosen to face this stage. The ground itself seemed to wait with them. The sand carried no footprints yet, untouched, holding its breath for what was to come. The walls of the arena stretched high above, their shadows adding to the feeling that the place was alive, listening. Whispers grew into quiet doubt. "This won't last long," some said. Others smirked, certain the moment would pass without any surprise. But the silence did not break, and with each passing second, the tension became heavier. Then, from the edge of the shadows, movement stirred. It was small, almost unnoticed at first, but enough to draw eyes away from the human. Shapes began to appear, slow and hesitant. Cubs, fragile, uncertain, and trembling, stepped into the light. Their presence made no sense to the watchers. Why send cubs into a place built for strength and battles? The arena seemed to tighten in that moment. What had started as whispers turned into confusion. This was not what the people had come to see. The silence deepened, not from boredom, but from anticipation. Something different was unfolding, something no one had predicted. The fight they expected was gone. In its place stood a scene no one could yet understand. The arena waited, holding its breath, as human and cubs faced one another under the heavy sky of silence. At the very center of the arena stood the human, surrounded by nothing but emptiness. The wide stretch of sand made the figure look even smaller, a lone speck under the watchful eyes of the crowd. There was no shield to hide behind, no wall to lean on, just open ground and the weight of countless stares pressing down. The human did not move with bravado. There were no clenched fists raised high, no attempt to appear larger or stronger than they were. Instead, there was stillness, quiet, a steady presence that almost seemed out of place in a place built for noise and spectacle. To those watching from above, it looked like fragility. "Too calm," someone whispered. "Too soft," another added. Many shook their heads, already convinced of the outcome. How could one human with no show of strength possibly stand a chance in this trial? Others had walked into the arena before, filled with confidence and loud shouts, eager to prove themselves. They swung weapons, stamped their feet, and roared to stir the crowd. But this one was different. There was no roar, no desperate act to capture attention. Just a steady figure waiting in silence, eyes calm, breath even. The quiet unsettled some. It didn't match what they had come expecting to see. Was it foolishness? Or was it courage too subtle for the crowd to recognize? Children in the stands leaned forward, curious. The older ones scoffed, certain this human would be forgotten by the end of the day. Yet a few, watching carefully, noticed something in the way the figure stood, not trembling, not rushing, but rooted, as if the silence was not a threat but a shield. Still, to the majority, the judgment was simple. Outnumbered, fragile, a person too ordinary to matter in a place that demanded greatness. They whispered their doubts, already turning the human into a failure in their minds. But down in the sand, none of those thoughts mattered. The human did not glance at the crowd, nor react to their murmurs. Alone in the vast circle, they stood not as the strongest body, but as the calmest spirit. It was this stillness, unnoticed by most, that would soon shift everything. The arena, still heavy with silence, suddenly shifted. From the far side, where the shadows clung to the walls, small shapes began to move. At first, it was hard to see what they were, but as they stepped into the light, the truth revealed itself. Cubs. They were young, no larger than the height of a person's knee. Their paws dragged slightly as they walked, as though every step cost them courage. Yet their eyes told a different story. Wide and sharp, they glimmered with a spirit far stronger than their trembling bodies. The crowd gasped. No one had expected this. Many leaned forward, unsure if they should be afraid for the cubs or afraid of them. Children in the stands whispered to their parents, asking why such small creatures had been brought into a place meant for trials and tests. The parents had no answer. The cubs themselves were restless. Some lowered their heads, scanning the ground nervously. Others let out tiny growls, soft but steady, as if to warn the world not to underestimate them. They were fragile, yes, but in their fragility was a spark of defiance. At the center of the arena, the human did not move. No fear showed on their face, only a quiet watchfulness. The cubs turned their gaze toward the lone figure. For a moment, the air grew even heavier, as though everyone was waiting for something unseen to unfold. Would the cubs attack? Would they scatter in fear? No one knew. The crowd held its breath, bracing for a clash, but instead of lunging forward, the cubs paused. Their ears twitched, their small bodies shivered, yet they did not retreat. Something about the human's calm presence held them still. It was not force, nor command, but something softer, something the crowd could not yet understand. To many in the stands, the sight was confusing. They wanted noise, they wanted chaos, but instead they saw an unexpected meeting, fragile cubs facing a fragile human. Two sides that by all reason should have feared each other, yet seemed bound by a quiet thread. No one cheered. No one mocked. They simply watched, caught in the strange stillness of the moment. What they didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The crowd waited for the human to make a move. Many expected weapons to rise, a sign of defense or perhaps fear, yet none came. The human's hands stayed lowered, steady and open, not in challenge, but in acceptance. It was a gesture so simple that most overlooked it. But the cubs did not. Step by step they edged closer, their paws pressing softly against the ground. Their small claws clicked faintly on the stone floor as they circled around, testing the space between them and the human. Their noses twitched, sniffing the air, searching for danger. But there was none. The calmness radiating from the human told them more than words ever could. A hush settled over the arena. Spectators leaned forward, straining to catch every detail. What was happening defied everything they had been taught. Humans and beasts did not meet in peace, especially not here, in this place built for conflict. The smallest cub moved first. Its body trembled as it stepped closer, its round eyes fixed on the human. For a moment it seemed ready to dart away, but then it stopped at the human's side. No growl came, no cry of fear. Instead, it sat down. Gasps rose from the stands. One by one, the others followed. They circled not as enemies, but as seekers of safety. Their ears twitched at every sound, but their gaze always returned to the calm figure in the center. Somehow, without words, the human had become their point of trust. The human did not smile nor reach out. They simply stood steady, letting the cubs decide. It was a quiet bond, invisible to the eye yet undeniable to the heart. Some in the audience scoffed, calling it luck. Others whispered, sensing something more, something unexplainable. The instructors exchanged glances, uncertain how to judge what they were witnessing. What could not be denied was this: the cubs had made their choice. They no longer saw the human as a stranger or a threat. They saw a presence that promised safety. Even in a place designed to test fear, the arena, built for battle, had instead become the stage for something unexpected. Trust, born in silence, and for the first time, the human was not standing alone. The silence of the arena broke with laughter. At first it came as small chuckles from the far corners, then it spread like a wave across the stands. Spectators leaned on each other, pointing down at the unlikely scene, a lone human surrounded by cubs. Too small and fragile to impress anyone. They will crumble, someone whispered loudly, and others nodded in agreement. Another voice mocked, "This is not a contest, it's a comedy." The words carried easily through the open air, reaching the ears of those below. The cubs shifted uneasily at the noise. Their tails flicked, ears pressed back against their heads. They did not understand the language of the crowd, but they understood the tone, mockery, sharp and cruel. One of them whimpered softly, but the human did not flinch. Standing steady in the center, the human's gaze stayed fixed forward, not upward. The laughter rained down, but it did not shake the calmness that had already drawn the cubs close. Instead of reacting to the crowd, the human bent slightly, meeting the cubs' eyes with quiet assurance. That small act was enough to steady them. Their trembling slowed. Their eyes softened. From the stands, more jeers followed. "What strength lies there? Weakness piled on weakness!" Others shook their heads in disappointment. To them, this was a waste of spectacle. The arena was meant for power, for displays of dominance. And yet, here stood a human who had chosen not to fight, not to roar, but to simply exist with fragile creatures at their side. Still, beneath the mockery, a few pairs of eyes lingered with curiosity. Not all were so quick to dismiss what they saw. Some leaned forward, trying to understand the calm that held the cubs so close. Perhaps they thought there was more happening than the crowd wished to admit. The human did not answer the laughter. They did not raise their voice or defend themselves. They let silence be their shield. To the cubs, that silence was strength. And though the crowd saw weakness, the bond in the center of the arena was growing stronger, quiet but unshakable. The mockery from the stands filled the air, but it could not reach the ground where trust was being built. The laughter had barely faded when the first true test arrived. A gate creaked open at the far end of the arena, the sound echoing against the high stone walls. The crowd grew restless, their jeers replaced by eager murmurs. Something was coming. From the shadows, a larger beast emerged, stronger, older, and clearly prepared to test both the human and the cubs. Its shoulders rippled with muscle as it stepped into the light, claws scraping the ground with each movement. The air thickened with tension. The cubs froze. Their small bodies pressed closer together, ears flicking nervously. For a moment, their courage wavered. They were young, inexperienced, and no match for what stood before them. All eyes shifted to the human. Would fear finally break through that calm? Would the bond that had formed so quietly fall apart at the first sign of danger? But the human did not run. They did not lift a weapon. Instead, they lowered themselves slightly, steadying their posture in a way the cubs could sense. One hand brushed lightly against the ground, signaling not panic but presence. The cubs watched closely, and slowly their trembling eased. The larger beast growled, circling them with heavy steps. The crowd roared, waiting for chaos. Yet what they saw instead was surprising. When the beast lunged forward, the human shifted, not to strike, but to guide. A quiet gesture, a movement of the arm, and the cubs followed. They scattered just enough to avoid the attack, regrouping quickly at the human's side. It wasn't strength that moved them, it was trust. The audience gasped. What looked like weakness only moments ago now appeared as something different. Coordination. The human was not leading with power, but with calm assurance. And the cubs, though small, mirrored that strength. The larger beast circled again, frustrated. The human remained steady, showing no fear. The cubs stood taller now, their small growls rising together. For the first time, they did not look helpless. The first challenge had come, not of force, but of spirit. And against the odds, the human and cubs had faced it together, proving that trust could be as powerful as any weapon. The air in the arena still carried tension from the first test, yet what stood out was not the growl of the beast nor the noise of the crowd. It was the stillness at the center. The human remained calm, their posture steady, their presence unshaken. There was no command shouted, no forceful gesture to control the cubs. Instead, there was something gentler, stronger, a silent sharing of courage. The cubs felt it. One by one, they drew closer, pressing shoulder to shoulder. Their small frames seemed fragile compared to the vast arena, yet together they formed something larger than themselves. They no longer scattered in fear. They moved as one, their hearts beating to the same rhythm of quiet bravery. The human looked at them, not as tools, not as burdens, but as companions. Without a single word, the message was clear. We face this together. It was a promise that steadied the trembling paws and lifted the drooping ears of the cubs. From the stands, the crowd shifted uneasily. They had expected panic, perhaps even surrender. What they saw instead was a unity that made mockery harder to sustain. The cubs were no longer circling aimlessly. They had formed a bond, and that bond had given them strength. The larger beast prowled nearby, frustrated by the calm. It had expected easy prey. Instead, it found resistance, not in claws or weapons, but in the unshakable wall of trust between a human and a group of cubs. The sight was strange, almost unsettling, for it challenged what the arena had always stood for. The human breathed slowly, steady as stone. Each inhale and exhale was like a signal, reminding the cubs that fear could be mastered. They stood tighter, their small growls rising together, not loud but united. It was in that moment the audience realized something powerful. Strength was not always about size or speed. Sometimes it was about standing still when everything else tried to break you apart. The human did not lead by force but by presence. And the cubs, once trembling in fear, now found their courage reflected back at them. For the first time, the arena saw not weakness, but unity, fragile in appearance, yet stronger than many dared to admit. The crowd had been waiting for the moment when everything would fall apart. They expected the cubs to scatter again, expected the human to falter, expected weakness to show itself under pressure. But that moment never came. Instead of breaking, something else happened. The bond that had seemed fragile began to grow stronger. The cubs, once uncertain and trembling, now moved with a surprising sense of purpose. They no longer clung only for safety. They stood because they trusted. Their small frames, when pressed together, carried the weight of resolve. At the center of it all was the human. No weapons, no loud commands, no force to push the cubs forward. Just quiet steadiness, like a flame refusing to go out even when the wind tried to snuff it away. That flame was small, but it was enough to light courage in others. The larger beast circled again, testing them, waiting for weakness. But this time the cubs did not back away. Their paws pressed firmly into the ground, their eyes sharp with something new, determination. The human did not need to tell them what to do. Their resolve had already been shaped by the calm presence they trusted. The spectators shifted uncomfortably. Whispers began to replace laughter. "They're not breaking," one muttered. Another leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "How are they holding together?" It was a sight the arena was not built for. This was not a display of individual power, but of shared strength. The human and the cubs, so mismatched in the eyes of many, had become a unit. What had looked weak now looked steady. What had seemed hopeless now carried a quiet sense of inevitability. The more the crowd doubted, the stronger the bond seemed to grow. The cubs' small growls began to echo, not as cries of fear, but as voices of unity. The human stood firm, letting that sound rise, letting it carry through the stone walls of the arena. What was once fragile now looked unshakable. And though the test was far from over, the shift was clear. The unexpected turn had come, and it was not in the breaking of the group, but in their becoming something far greater than anyone believed they could be. The noise in the arena had shifted. Where once there was laughter, now there was silence broken only by quiet murmurs. The same people who had mocked now leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the strange sight below. They saw not weakness anymore. What unfolded before them was different, something steady, something brave. The human, still calm and unshaken, stood with the cubs gathered close, their small bodies pressed together, no longer trembling as before. The crowd could see it clearly now. This was not fear holding them, it was loyalty. "Do you see that?" Someone whispered from the stands. Another nodded, their earlier smirk gone. "They're not breaking. They're standing." The shift was subtle, but powerful. Where laughter once ruled, respect began to grow. Even those who wanted to dismiss it could not look away. There was something magnetic about the human's quiet strength, something impossible to mock when paired with the cub's fierce determination. The larger beast prowled at the edge, still circling, still waiting for a chance. But it no longer looked like a fight between predator and prey. It looked like a test, one that the group in the center was determined to face together. The crowd saw courage where they had expected collapse. The cubs lifted their small heads, their growls steady now, carrying not fear, but defiance. Each sound echoed like a promise. They would not abandon the one who had stood with them. The human's silence spoke louder than words, showing them a kind of strength that came not from dominance, but from presence. The audience, though restless, began to feel the weight of what they were witnessing. This was no ordinary moment in the arena. It was not about a lone fighter or a beast's victory. It was about loyalty, something that could not be forced, only earned. Respect, once absent, had begun to rise in whispers. It was quiet, almost reluctant, but it was there. For the first time, people looked down not with ridicule, but with something close to admiration. The human had not demanded it. The cubs had not sought it. Yet, by simply standing together, they had changed the hearts of those watching. The arena had always been a place where power was measured by strikes, shouts, and dominance. But this time was different. The human never lifted a hand in anger, never drew a weapon, never even raised their voice. Their strength was quiet, almost invisible, yet it carried more weight than steel. The cubs felt it first. They had been trembling before, unsure of themselves, but now they stood taller. They mirrored the human's calm presence as if it had flowed directly into their small hearts. Every steady breath the human took seemed to give them courage. Every still movement told them, "You are not alone. You are safe." Their roars began softly, shaky at first, like voices learning to speak. But the more they stood in unity, the bolder those roars became. One cub cried out, and another joined, then another, until the sound filled the arena. It was not the thunder of giants, but it was powerful in its own way. It was the sound of courage being born. The crowd leaned in. What they heard was not fear. It was defiance, loyalty, and spirit echoing through the walls of the silent arena. The cubs were not just imitating a protector. They were becoming protectors themselves. The larger beast that circled them slowed, its head tilting at the strange scene. It had expected easy prey, a quick display of strength. Instead, it was met with a wall of roars rising from creatures too small to fight with muscle, yet too brave to step back. Behind them stood the human, unshaken, steady as stone. For those watching, the message was clear. Strength did not always need weapons. It did not always roar the loudest or strike the hardest. Sometimes true strength was the ability to stand calm in chaos, to inspire others to rise even when defeat seemed certain. The cubs' voices grew louder, bolder, filling every corner of the arena until no laughter remained, only silence and awe. Their roars carried the strength of the one they trusted, a strength that could not be mocked or broken. And in that moment, the crowd witnessed something unforgettable: power without force, leadership without command. For many in the stands, the arena had always been about force. The strongest claw, the sharpest weapon, the loudest roar. But as the scene unfolded, it became clear that this moment was something else entirely. The human had never struck, never threatened, and yet they had become the center of unshakable trust. The cubs pressed close, their roars rising not out of fear but out of loyalty. Together they faced what stood before them, not as scattered individuals, but as a unit bound by something deeper. It was not strength of muscle that held them together. It was spirit. The crowd began to realize this. Whispers spread like wind through the stands. "This isn't a battle," someone murmured. "It's a test." The words carried weight, because what they saw could not be explained by force alone. The cubs should have run. The human should have fallen. Yet here they stood, stronger than anyone expected. The larger beast paced, unsettled by what it faced. It had power, it had size, but it did not have the one thing that now filled the center of the arena: heart. The cubs had chosen where they belonged, and it was not with fear or with the crowd's judgment. They had chosen the one who had stood quietly, patiently, and without demand. To them, the human was not weak. The human was alpha. No ceremony had declared it. No rule had been written to prove it. But in the language of trust, it was clear. The cubs no longer followed because they needed protection. They followed because they believed. The spectators, once mocking, now sat in heavy silence. Some lowered their heads, ashamed of their laughter. Others leaned forward, unable to look away. For the first time, they saw strength redefined before their eyes. The test was not about crushing an opponent. It was about standing without breaking, about carrying loyalty when no one else believed. The human had passed, and in doing so lifted the cubs with them. What the arena had witnessed was more than survival. It was the quiet crowning of a leader, one chosen not by force but by heart. The arena, once filled with noise, now held a silence so deep it felt alive. Moments ago, the stands had echoed with laughter and jeers, but now not a single voice rose. The same crowd that had mocked was now frozen, their eyes fixed on the scene before them. At the center stood the human, calm and steady, with the cubs pressed close around. No weapon was raised, no victory was shouted. Yet the air carried something greater than any cheer, a heavy respect. It was the kind of silence that said more than words ever could. For the first time, the spectators realized what they were truly witnessing. This was not weakness. This was not failure. It was strength shown in its purest form, not through force, but through patience, courage, and heart. The cubs had chosen their alpha, and the human had proven worthy without lifting a single blade. Eyes in the crowd shifted. Some who had mocked earlier now felt shame. Others sat with their mouths slightly open, struggling to understand how what seemed so fragile had turned into something so powerful. Even the young in the stands leaned forward, sensing they were seeing a story that would be told long after this day. The silence grew heavier with every passing second. It was not empty, it was full. Full of unspoken respect, full of recognition that something rare had taken place. The absence of applause was not because the crowd had nothing to give, but because clapping felt too small, too ordinary for what had unfolded. The human did not bow, did not claim the silence as a prize. Instead, they simply stood, their calm presence unshaken, as if the moment was never about the crowd at all. The cubs stayed close, their tiny bodies firm and proud, roaring softly as if to echo the truth of what had happened. This was not victory in the usual sense. It was something greater, a lesson, a reminder. And the silence of the arena was proof that everyone understood. Respect did not need noise. It lived in stillness, carried in the heart, heavier than any applause. The silence of the arena lingered, but within it, a powerful message was unfolding. The human had not shouted orders, had not forced the cubs into obedience, and yet they followed. They did not follow out of fear. They stayed close because they trusted. It became clear to all who watched that this was not the picture of dominance. It was something far more rare, leadership through loyalty. The cubs had felt it first. They sensed calm where there could have been chaos and strength where there was no need for force. The crowd now saw what the cubs had already known. Leadership, the human showed, was not about standing above others. It was about standing with them. It was not about control, but about trust. With every small roar from the cubs, with every glance of courage in their young eyes, it became obvious that they were stronger because they were not alone. Spectators began to understand the lesson hidden in front of them. Many had believed leadership was proven only through battle, through victories won and opponents crushed. But this moment challenged that belief. Here was a human, unarmed, outnumbered, and still standing. Yet the real strength was not in defiance, but in the quiet ability to inspire. Some in the stands thought about their own lives. They remembered leaders who had shouted, threatened, or demanded. But none of those voices had left a lasting mark the way this silence did. The human had shown that loyalty freely given was more powerful than loyalty forced. The cubs pressed tighter, no longer trembling, but standing proud. They did not see the human as a master. They saw them as one of their own. That bond, unspoken and natural, was something that no threat could break. The crowd could only watch as the scene before them carved itself into memory. This was an example no one had expected, and perhaps no one would forget. The human had turned an arena of noise into a place of stillness, and in that stillness they had rewritten the meaning of leadership, proving it was not measured by dominance, but by the loyalty you inspire, The arena that had once echoed with laughter and doubt now shook with a sound no one could ignore. The cubs, who had entered timid and uncertain, lifted their voices in roars that rolled across the walls. They were no longer the small, trembling creatures that had been mocked. Their voices carried weight, power, and meaning. Each roar was not just noise, it was a declaration. It told the crowd that they were not weak, not helpless, and never alone. With every sound that thundered out, their bond with the human grew clearer. They were not roaring out of fear. They were roaring out of strength born from trust. The human stood quietly at the center, no weapon in hand, no command shouted. Yet it was their presence that sparked this transformation. The cubs' courage was not borrowed, it was awakened. They had found their voices because someone believed in them without asking for anything in return. For the spectators, the sound was unforgettable. Many who had come expecting failure now sat in silence, realizing they were witnessing something greater than victory. The roars were more than animal cries. They were the sound of loyalty, courage, and unity. It was as if the cubs were telling the world, "We are not weak. We stand together." Some in the audience felt chills. Others looked down, ashamed that they had laughed earlier. They saw now that the very thing they had mocked was stronger than any show of brute force. Strength was not always in the strike of a fist or the swing of a blade. It could be in the roar of those who chose to stand together. The human did not need to speak. Their calm gaze and steady posture said everything. The cubs, once voiceless, had found a roar that would be remembered far beyond the walls of that arena. And it was not just their voices that echoed. It was the message behind them. That day, the arena was given a sound it would never forget, the roar of courage, born beside a human, carried by cubs, and remembered by all who heard it. Long after the crowd had left and the arena returned to its usual silence, the memory of that day lived on. People spoke of it not as a simple match, but as a turning point. It was remembered as the day when the walls echoed, not with the clash of weapons or the cries of defeat, but with the roar of courage that rose beside a human. At first, many had laughed. They had seen weakness in a lone figure standing with cubs, yet the ending told a different story. Weakness had not remained weakness. It had transformed into strength that touched every soul watching. That was the true legacy of the arena, how something fragile became unforgettable. Generations later, the story was still shared. Trainers told new cadets about the human who chose calm over force, and about the cubs who found their voices in unity. Elders reminded the young that strength is not always about power or control, but about standing firm when others expect you to fall. The lesson reached far beyond that single day. For the cubs, their roars became more than sound. They became a symbol, a reminder that courage can be taught not with fear, but with trust. And for the human, though their name faded into history, their example remained clear. They had proven that true leadership does not need a crown, a weapon, or loud commands. Sometimes it only needs a heart that refuses to give up. The arena itself became a place of quiet respect. People who walked through it years later could almost hear the echo of those voices. The silence carried weight, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened there. It was no longer just a battleground. It was a place where weakness was redefined and courage was born. The legacy was simple, yet powerful. Strength can rise from where no one expects it. The human and the cubs proved that unity is stronger than mockery and loyalty is louder than doubt. And so the silent arena that once waited for defeat would forever be remembered as the place where cubs roared beside a human and turned silence into a story that would never fade.